Hello learners, in the last class we have seen part 1 of Genesis, how God created the heaven and the earth and how he created man in his own image and how the things had fallen apart because of man's sin and disobedience. Later on, God still considers man and then he selects Noah and this lineage continues through Noah. So, now in the second part of the book of Genesis, we will learn about the lineage of Abraham and the people who follow. Now, let us look at the introduction. Now, we have observed in part 1 of Genesis that Genesis is the foundational book to the Bible and that Genesis covers more time than any other book in the Bible. While the first part deals with the creation and the early history of humans, the second part narrates the patriarchic history and the beginning of a nation. An important feature of this part of Genesis is its genealogies. Although these can be off-putting for the modern readers, lacking the dramatic tension of the narrative episodes, they contribute in a special way to the structure of Genesis. Genesis has 2 linear genealogies covering 10 generations each, naming one ancestor in each. The period of Adam and Eve is linked to Noah by a genealogy, and the period from Noah's son Shem to Abraham is linked with the next. Other than these, there are other segmented genealogies giving limited information about the characters of secondary interest. This part also shows that the new world after the flood was also spoiled by human sin. Then the call of Abraham, through whom all the nations would be blessed, gives a hope that God's purpose will eventually be realized through Abraham's descendants. Of the second part of Genesis, the patriarchic history of Genesis is found from 11th chapter to 50th chapter. The book of Genesis originated thousands of years ago and it was composed in an age and culture far removed from the experiences of modern readers. Genesis employs literary techniques not commonly used today. Woven into stories set in a Near Eastern or Mediterranean culture, the narrative now moves from the general survey of humanity to the specific family from which Israel comes. The narrative style becomes severely matter of fact. The narrator devotes much more time to describing the lives of characters. When the first 11 chapters cover many generations, only 4 generations in 39 chapters deal with the patriarchic history. It begins with Abraham and goes on to his son Isaac and Isaac's 2 sons Esau and Jacob, and the final selection deals with Jacob's 12 sons with special mention of Joseph. Throughout these chapters, the readers will see how God has preserved the members of his chosen family whose calling was to walk with him and to be a channel by which the blessing comes to the entire world. Learners, today we are going to study the second part of Genesis, We have seen in part 1 that Moses is the narrator of the book at around 1500 BC to 1300 BC, and several hundreds of centuries must have separated him from the patriarchs. Although Genesis is a history book, its history is packaged in highly literary forms, the most dominant of which is hero story. It is very complex with numerous genres converging in it. It is an anthology or collection of diverse works. The book of Genesis is primarily a collection of hero stories. In keeping with the nature of heroic narrative, the heroes of Genesis, all for their uniqueness in the drama of salvation history, are also representatives of the human condition generally. We can see our own experiences in their stories, and their heroism is in many cases a model for us to emulate. A literary approach to the book of Genesis requires that we think correctly about the concept of a literary hero. A literary hero in Genesis is a representative of the culture producing him. However, the heroes here are not wholly idealized. Much of what a storyteller aims to say about life is embodied in the characteristics and experiences of the hero. As we read a hero story, we become the observant traveling companion of the hero, sharing his or her experiences and learning the lessons that he has learned. Even though Genesis is an anthology of diverse forms, there are underlying storylines that unify the book. A unifying plot line is covenant history, where there is the story of the binding agreements by which God relates to his people. God is the only character which is present from the beginning to the end. And in the overall story of Genesis, God is the protagonist or a central character. All the human characters in the story interact with this great protagonist and his designs. Being a book where the arena of action is usually the family, 5 couples occupy much of our interest: Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, Jacob and Rachel. In the last few verses of the first part of Genesis speak of a person named Terah, who was the descendant of Shem, Noah's son. Terah was the father of Abram, later called Abraham. He decides to move out of Ur, the land of Canaan, through Haran. According to the Kultib texts, these are the texts that are composed by Assyrian traders from 19th century BC. Haran was an important crossroad and commercial center. It was an area of northern Mesopotamia. The ancient city of Ur lies 300 kilometers southeast of modern Baghdad. Ur became an important city in Mesopotamia near the end of the 3rd millennium BC. The 3rd dynasty of Ur was founded in the years 2113 BC to 2006 BC. This period was one of great peace and prosperity, the high point of city's existence. This Ur, according to the narrator, was the birthplace of the Hebrew patriarch Abraham. After many generations, there is a divine speech that suddenly and unexpectedly introduces this section. This sets the agenda not only for Abraham, but also his descendants. Here, the narrator shows that God's plan for Abraham have both national and international dimensions, which are developed in the episodes that follow. Here again, as pointed out in part 1 of Genesis, Moses wants the Israelites to know the intervention of God in human lives. These Israelites are the descendants of Abraham and are the chosen race for the birth of the Messiah or the Christ, and they needed to maintain and sanctify themselves. By choosing or setting apart Abraham from the rest, Moses tries to show and prove to Israelites that being the descendants of Abraham, they too needed to set themselves apart by following a few rules of worshipping God, by not eating things that were described as unclean by the law, and separate themselves as a race by circumcising all their males. Moses here is trying to prove the obedience and disciplined life of patriarchs before handing the law to them. In part 1, we have seen the significance of the title Genesis as the beginning of time, creation, human race, sin, etc. Let us now see the significance of the title to part 2. For the first time in the book or in the entire human race after creation, God sets apart a man called Abram for himself. God himself changes his name from Abram to Abraham, meaning father of a nation. After the flood and after the Tower of Babel episode, many nations might have been formed around the world based on their languages and regions. But here in this particular region of Mesopotamia, the narrator wants to show that just at the time of creation, God set apart for himself and gave more priority to the human race. So here too, God has set apart this particular man called Abraham for himself, and through his lineage, the entire nation of Israel is formed, and from this nation would raise the Savior or the Messiah of the human race, as the human race is in a fallen state from the time it was created. This is the first nation in the Bible which is shown as the chosen race by God, and hence it is the origin of the Jewish history and the origin of the Jewish nation, later called Israel. So Moses here, before giving the law, tries to describe the lives of the patriarchs, their faith and their obedience to the will of God, and how the lives of each of these patriarchs is being controlled and monitored by the divine power. Here again, through this race, God again begins to take interest in the human race through one man, Abraham, and his descendants thereafter. Here, for the first time, we see how God gives importance to the woman Sarah, Abraham's wife. God stresses on the child born to Abraham through Sarah. Though Abraham had other concubines, and though children born to them were Abraham's children, God gives importance to the child born to Sarah, as she was his wife in a God-ordained relationship, and the child born to her was the child of a free woman and not the child of a slave woman or a concubine. Here the narrator is trying to stress the importance of one woman in a God-ordained relationship in maintaining the race. The family line of Abraham forms the background of the entire book. Abraham was the son of Terah, who was a descendant of Shem, son of Noah. After a period of around 10 generations, narrator again introduces the voice of God, where God calls Abraham to leave his country and move to a place that God would be showing him. God's invitation to Abraham challenges him to abandon the normal sources of personal identity and security, his family and country. To obey, Abraham must trust God implicitly. All human support is largely removed. The promised outcomes are conditional on Abraham's obedience. With all obedience to God, Abraham migrates with everything he possesses from northern Mesopotamia to Canaan. Abraham had under him a substantial number of men, many of whom might have been herdsmen or those bought with money as foreigners. On one occasion, God promises land to the offsprings. In response, Abraham builds an altar to the Lord. The construction of altars is a common feature of patriarchic history because no central sanctuary existed before Exodus from Egypt. Then the divine speech of the Lord God emphasizes not only the extent of the land his descendants would inherit, but also how numerous they will be. In spite of all these, Abraham remained childless and Sarah remained barren. Impatient for an heir, Sarah seeks to resolve the problem of her barrenness by having her maid servant, an Egyptian girl Hagar, to bear child on her behalf. Abraham listens to Sarah and Hagar bears him a son, Ishmael. Hagar's status within Abraham's household is changed from servant to a wife, although this does not place her on par with Sarah. Hagar's ability to conceive causes her to look down on Sarah. By naming Ishmael, Abraham publicly acknowledges him as his son and heir. After a certain time, there is divine intervention again, and 3 men or angels in the form of men visit Abraham and announce to him that God's promise to him of a son as an heir would be fulfilled only through Sarah. After the prophetic words of these 3 men, Sarah conceives and bears Abraham a son in his old age, who they called Isaac, meaning laughter. In due course, Isaac is confirmed as an heir when God instructs Abraham to listen to Sarah his wife and send away Hagar and Ishmael. Here Isaac, son of a free woman or wife, takes the priority over the son of a slave woman. After the birth of Isaac and after he being declared as an heir, an episode follows which brings to climax of God's ongoing interaction with Abraham, resulting in an important divine oath. With the departure of Ishmael, Isaac had become Abraham's only son. Here, God tests Abraham, telling him to sacrifice his only son. Abraham, with all humility, obeys God's voice and goes up a mountain with Isaac. Seeing his love and obedience, God stops Abraham from killing the boy and promises him manifold blessings by saying that in his offspring shall all the earth be blessed. After the death of Sarah, Abraham sends his trusted servant to get a wife for Isaac from his kinsmen. He is deeply concerned that Isaac should not marry a girl from Canaan. He fears that this will draw him away from worshipping the Lord. When Isaac was 40 years old, the servant found Rebekah from Abraham's native town and brought her to Isaac. The account of how Rebekah becomes Isaac's wife forms one of the longest episodes in the book of Genesis. Displaying exceptional narrative skills, the author highlights how God controls events so that after a long journey from Canaan to northern Mesopotamia, Abraham's servant is guided to Rebekah. The journey would have taken Abraham's servant approximately 21 days to travel. Just like Abraham, Rebekah too had to leave her family and country in an act of faith to journey to Canaan and marry Isaac, whom she has never seen or met. The narrator points out how God orchestrated the servant's faithfulness, Rebekah's positive response, and some unlikely events to bring about the marriage of Isaac. Like Sarah, Rebekah too was barren, but the Lord responds to Isaac's prayer and Rebekah conceives. It is pointed out that children struggle within her womb, and when she inquires, the Lord responds saying, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided." So Rebekah gives birth to two boys, Esau and Jacob. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter whom Isaac loved, and Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents and was loved by his mother Rebekah. This section plays an important role in showing Isaac's and Rebekah's twin sons Esau and Jacob, who become the central characters. The account of their birth anticipates the future developments in the story. The observation that the children struggled within her shows that the relationship between the twins is largely hostile. Jacob was born holding his brother's heel, so the name Jacob means deceiver, that is, to grab someone by the heel. The motive of deception appears in a number of episodes associated with Jacob, where he exploits his brother and makes him sell his birthright for a bowl of lentil soup, and again after a certain period of time he cheats Esau and his blind father Isaac to get the family blessings. This builds the enmity between both the brothers. Now Esau begins to wait for the death of his father so that he could kill Jacob. When Rebekah comes to know of Esau's plan to kill Jacob, she speaks to Isaac and expresses her dissatisfaction of the local woman that Esau had married. So Isaac and Rebekah together plan to send Jacob to their hometown in northern Mesopotamia to get a wife from their kinsmen. So now Jacob runs away from his brother and moves on to his hometown and meets his uncle Laban. Laban is Rebekah's brother. He falls in love with Rachel, Laban's younger daughter, and serves him for 7 years for marrying her. Here the episode is full of irony. Having deceived his father by pretending to be the firstborn, Jacob himself is now deceived by his uncle Laban into marrying his firstborn daughter Leah. Later, Laban permits Jacob to marry Rachel, but only on the condition that Jacob will work for 7 more years in order to pay the bride price. Jacob works for 7 more years for Rachel. Both the sisters, in their competitiveness to bear children for Jacob, give their servant girls to Jacob. So, after a certain period of time, Jacob is left with 4 wives and 12 sons. Now on his way back to Canaan, Jacob in his dream wrestles with a man of whom he is convinced as a divine power. This man blesses Jacob and changes his name to Israel, which means an encounter with God. Jacob's successors increased with his 12 sons and their families. Among his 12 sons, the last 2 being Rachel's sons, were loved more by Jacob. Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel and last but one son of Jacob, and his father bestowed on him the privileges normally given to the firstborn in the family. Joseph's royal dreams of all his household bowing before him further antagonize his older brothers, who could not accept that he will reign over them. Joseph's actions alienate him from his brothers. So, when the opportunity presents itself, they sell Joseph into slavery in Egypt. As a slave in Egypt, Joseph finds favor wherever he is employed. In the prison too, he interprets the dreams of 2 of his fellow prisoners, who are the king's royal attendants. These events prepare the way for Joseph to be later summoned from prison to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. The lengthy episode of interpreting Pharaoh's dreams gives a dramatic rise in Joseph's status from a prisoner in the king's jail to becoming the chief administrator in Egypt. Joseph is made the vizier to govern all people in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. Things in Egypt move as predicted by Joseph. There was a severe famine. However, Joseph's preparations ensure that food is available not just for Egypt but the whole of Mediterranean region. Shortage of food in Canaan forces Jacob to send his sons to Egypt. When Joseph finally encounters his brothers, he deliberately conceals his identity. About 20 years have passed since his brothers last saw Joseph at the age of 17. Joseph recognizes them and for a few episodes conceals his identity. After a few episodes, Joseph is unable to restrain his emotions. He reveals himself to his brothers and in a long speech attempts to dissipate the sense of guilt by stressing God's role in sending him to Egypt in order to preserve the life of his family from famine. Unsurprisingly, when Jacob hears this, he relocates with his entire family to Egypt. Joseph uses his administrative skills to ensure that the family settles safely in Egypt. The final section of Genesis focuses on the death of Joseph. With death imminent, Joseph makes arrangements for his bones to be taken to Canaan. Thus, generation ends with the sentence, "They embalmed him and put him in a coffin in Egypt." So, learners, here we have seen how Genesis ends. In part 1, Genesis begins by saying, "In the beginning, God created." But in the part 2, we see that death is imminent, and here it ends with the phrase or the sentence, "They embalmed him and put him in a coffin in Egypt." Thank you.